This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning. Can I welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public here in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members to make sure that electronic devices aren't in front of your microphones. Can I ask the clerk, Nicoletta Kemp, to confirm apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Caroline Russell, for whom Assembly Member Zoe Garbutt is substituting today.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and thank you, Zoe, for joining us today. Moving on to declaration of interest, can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members?
Noted.
Thank you. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? No? Perfect. On to minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee on the 22nd of May, the 13th of June and the 11th of July to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Summary list of actions. I think we've got a couple of comments on these. Assembly Member Garbutt.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So it's just wanting to say thank you for the report that's been presented on the expenses and benefit governance framework, including the carbon offsetting procedures, and just had a couple of questions. I do note that the next action in the table of actions is around an establishment of a sustainable travel policy. But I do have just a brief couple of comments on this framework that I just wanted noting. So I just wondered if there was a chance to further feedback on this document, if the committee will see a draft of that sustainable travel policy and how those will be finalised. And then just had a couple of comments on this document, mainly to incorporate train use more explicitly. So in paragraph 2.2, there's two key principles, but we'd really like to see a third principle about making it easier to use trains and other non-flying lower carbon options. Possibly including something like Possible's climate perks, but just incorporating that more explicitly. And at 6.4, there's it ranks emissions by trips booked through a corporate travel management system, but there's no mention of trains as an option of travel. And then at point 3, slightly different topic, but on the carbon offsetting, this really hasn't been used by the GLA so far. So we have to looked into the GLA offsetting and found that it's funding wind power and solar cookers in China and fuel-efficient stoves in Sudan, so still using some fossil fuels. So we think the reporting should include offsets data that's in an annual form and could help provide a form of reporting to go alongside the carbon budgeting as an outturn. So it's just those, mainly the trains point, which I think is quite an explicit kind of oversight. And obviously that point about how we incorporate that again in that sustainable travel policy.
Thank you. And Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to comment on Appendix 3, which is the response from Mary Harpley about job families. I know we have a discussion next week, a private session where we can discuss it in more detail, but I think it is just worth saying that I'm not sure the response really engages with some of the detailed concerns that were raised, particularly about how much work has been done, there is still to do. It's a little bit woolly on that and the level of engagement that there has been with staff so far, and whether that's sort of meaningful or not. So I'm looking forward to speaking to them about that next week, but I thought it was worth logging that.
Thank you. And I wonder if they're looking forward to speaking to us next week. Okay, thank you, members. Moving on to action taken under delegated authority, can I ask the committee to note the following recent action taken under delegated authority by the Chair of the London Assembly on consultation with the Deputy Chair of the London Assembly and party group lead members to agree the London Assembly Annual Report 23-24 as attached in Appendix 1. Thank you. Then can we move on to responses to committee outputs? Can we note the responses from the Mayor of London to the following outputs? The report of the former Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee on London's resilience, and the committee's letters on the GLA Finance Fund and the London Pensioners Fund Authority. Thank you. Final one. is a proposal of delegation of authority. Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with members of the election review working group to agree the output arising from the working group's programme of work? Many thanks. And now we can move on to our main item of business today. Thank you to our guests for waiting patiently whilst we sorted out some of that business. So we're moving on to the main item of cybersecurity in the public sector. I'd like to welcome to the Chamber Madeleine Carr, the Professor of Global Politics and Cybersecurity from the University College of London, and Gareth Miles, Head of Crime at the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, City of London Police. Really delighted to have you here today, so thank you to help us in this first of this two-part investigation in kind of building the picture of cybersecurity threats. So with that said, I'd like to open and perhaps come to you first, Madeleine, and ask, is cybersecurity a growing risk to organisations in the UK at present?
Yes, it is, unfortunately, and it's something that, you know, really when we look back over the kind of last 50 years of the digital revolution, it really hasn't improved a lot. In fact, in many ways, we could say that we're less secure now than we were 50 years ago. So, and there are all kinds of interesting, complex reasons for that we look at in my team. Some of them, of course, are technical, but in some ways, those are the easier problems to address. The difficulty with technical solutions is that we're lacking the kind of market drivers that we would have expected to kick in and propagate those. So there's a very limited market for very secure software and hardware. But the more interesting problems and the ones that we can work on more are these kind of human factors, organizational factors, and economic factors that feed into this very insecure ecosystem that we now, in a way, it's become the kind of water that we swim in, and it's normalized, but it need not be. I think for a lot of organizations, I mean, there are some very common threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigations, very, very common and well understood. But there are also some unique characteristics of different sectors and different types of organizations that make them vulnerable in different ways. And I have a particular interest in these kind of organizations that are quite difficult to secure, organizations like the public sector. And we also do a lot of work in higher education in the UK, which is interesting and challenging for a whole lot of different reasons. But yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about what some of those challenges are that I see in the public sector and perhaps in the GLA specifically. I guess, you know, it's common knowledge, or it certainly would be knowledge amongst people in this room, that local authorities and councils in the UK have suffered a number of very significant breaches and serious breaches, and part of what makes them attractive and vulnerable. Part of what makes them attractive is that, of course, there's a lot of very, very valuable data held within these organizations, and data that, you know, fetches a good price in the criminal market. But what makes them, you know, even more interesting and complex from a cybersecurity perspective is the very critical functions that are carried out by local government. And those are some of the you know, the implications that we've seen in Copeland, in Hackney, this kind of, you know, really shutting down of very critical systems within society. So there's this, you know, very critical functions of local government and the very valuable data that makes them a target. I don't know if I should leave it there or pass over to Gareth.
Yeah, sure. There'll be lots of chat over the next hour, so I'm sure it will come out. Gareth, turning to you, how big is that growing risk, and also what are the biggest challenges specifically in public organisations?
Please call me Gary. Only my mother calls me Gareth, and that's usually when I've done something wrong. The figures show that Computer Misuse Act offences are increasing. So the Crime Survey of England and Wales estimated there was 1.02 million incidents of Computer Misuse Act. That's a 37% increase on the previous year. UK businesses approximately suffered about 7.78 million attacks to their system through DDoS. So yes, it is a problem that's increasing. Part of the problem is in my responsibility, the reporting of those offences. Through the Action Fraud Service, received 40,000 allegations last year of Computer Misuse Act. The most prolific ones of those, about 65%, were business email compromises or social media hacking as the main avenue of attacks. The main threat is still phishing emails, and whilst local authorities and various different companies will employ secure email gateways or SEGs, actually 52% of the attacks that came through bypassed those SEGs. So whilst I agree that there are technical solutions out there, equally some of those technical solutions need to mature. I think part of the problem that we see is that the networks that are contained within certainly public sector authorities are more of the elderly nature, as it were, and to have the governance and the oversight to ensure that those networks are up to date, are as secure as they can be, and then going on to the process of educating staff and limiting those attacks that actually get through, is an area that we could look at. Ransomware is currently just to quote, it's the greatest and serious and organised cyber crime threat, the largest cyber security threat, and poses a risk to the UK's national security. They have a significant impact on victims due to financial data and service losses, which can lead to business closure and inaccessible public service and compromised data. Looking at some of the things, a recent report by Sophos highlighted that ransomware payments, the median ransomware payment by victims increased by 400% last year to $2 million, an average of $2 million. Recovery costs to victims of ransomware attack have also increased over the same time frame from $1.8 to $2.7 million just to recover once you've been the victim of an attack. So that's, the data shows us that ransomware is probably the biggest threat in terms of cybersecurity as it stands at the moment.
And would you say that public organisations are targeted more often than private organisations, or is it just coming back to that elderly nature of the defence that means that these kind of attacks happen more regularly?
I don't actually have a breakdown on public sector being targeted, but what I can say is 58% of large businesses last year were victims of an attack. 49% of medium businesses, 29% of small businesses, and 19% of micro businesses were victims of attack. As I think it's now nearly somewhere in the region of about 75% of fraud offences are cyber-enabled. Actually, the more valuable data that can be extracted are from the larger organisations and the public sector organisations for them to be able to commit other offences, not just the cybersecurity attack, the cybercrime attack that initiates.
Thanks. And Madeline, how do you see these attacks evolving in the next decade or so?
The next decade is a long time in cyber years, but I would say the kind of more immediate challenges that are kind of coming over the horizon that we're perhaps not properly prepared for at this point would be one would be supply chain, this incredibly complex. So as we've got better at kind of hardening the perimeter of organizations, and in that sense we have improved cybersecurity to an extent. What attackers are doing is coming in through the supply chain. So many of these attacks now we see from these little small organizations that we outsource different functions to. You might remember that Move It attack a couple of years ago. It's just a tiny piece of software that large organizations use to transfer big files securely. So big HR files, for example. It's just a tiny app. But so many organizations used that little app, and it itself was vulnerable. So these supply chain attacks, and understanding the supply chain of an organization like the GLA be extremely difficult, because it's not just the suppliers that are used by this organization, it's the suppliers that the suppliers use and the suppliers that those suppliers use. So it's kind of a whole ecosystem of vulnerabilities. I would say also one of the things that we could get out ahead of now is this kind of performative cybersecurity. Like, of course, staff training is important, but the way we do staff training now is very disconnected from people's actual jobs. So people are asked to learn or memorize certain processes and procedures that in many cases get in the way of them actually delivering what they are hired to do. And there's very little dialogue back and forth between why people don't carry out those processes in the way that the cybersecurity team would like them to. And that's one of the things that's really holding organizations like this one back. I'd say also these kind of risks we're seeing of people using AI at work, again, kind of linked to the idea that people want to do their jobs better, more quickly, more efficiently. But we've just we're undergoing a piece of work at UCL looking at how people are using Otter AI or other free AI tools to take minutes in meetings and to write actions emerging from those meetings. It's very understandable why people would do that, because it's a real time saver and very accurate. But the data, when they use a free tool, that data is not maintained on our estate. It's used to train other AI systems, and so we're, technically we could be in breach of GDPR by doing that. Now we could say, well, let's get everyone Microsoft Copilot. We obviously have an enterprise license for Microsoft products at UCL, but that would cost us, believe it or not, that would be £27 million a year for us to give everyone access to Copilot. So that's clearly not feasible. And I think thinking through how these problems are emerging is also really important. I'd say the biggest challenge is just this continued acceptance of insecure products in the marketplace, and the fact that we're constantly buying a raincoat full of holes, and then finding out where one hole is and we need to mend it, and then finding out where another hole is and we need to mend that one, and then eventually being told that raincoat is no longer in service and we're going to have to buy a new raincoat and start all over again. That is a poor ecosystem for a highly connected society, and that's one that goes beyond the remit of the GLA, certainly, but until we can think more critically and constructively about the way we buy software, services, and hardware, we're going to have to cope with these things in more granular ways.
Thanks. And Gary, I wanted to just say you both answered the question so well. All my supplementaries are basically answered, but I've just got one final question. Yeah, not quite yet. On shared services and IT shared services. So, for example, in the GLA here, we've recently moved to working with TfL on a shared IT system. Councils do this a lot with different services. Does that present an opportunity to further secure, because you've got a wider network, perhaps more funds to better secure that network, or perhaps does it give more vulnerabilities because you're allowing more people into the same network?
I think the wider your network is, the more vulnerabilities that there are. However, for me, there are four key challenges for me that for cybersecurity in the public sector. One is resilience, and that's ensuring systems can withstand and recover from cyber attacks. And that's integrating cybersecurity and resilience into the overall organizational strategy, not leaving it as just an IT problem but making sure that resilience is understood from board level right down through the whole organization as to the importance of it. Then you can deliver the technical solutions, as I've mentioned, like gateways, port scanning, various different things along those lines. Secondly, greatest threat is innovation, and that's balancing the security with the need for technology advancement. For me, at the moment, there's an imbalance between functionality, accessibility, and security. People want to be able to do everything through their technology, and they want to be able to do it anywhere, and therefore sometimes security is the thing that is overlooked for occasions. So it's getting that accurate and correct balance right. Trust, in order to maintain trust in government services and the services that are being provided, ensuring that you have the right speed and balance for which those services can be supplied when they're needed, but equally have the right security to understand that they're not being exploited. Adaptability, for me, I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's the thing that keeps me awake at night, but keeping up with evolving threats and technologies. AI is huge at the moment. Lots of people are talking about ChatGPT and others, but the growth of artificial intelligence has just widened the accessibility for criminals to be able to use other attack vectors and legitimize and impersonate genuine attack vectors in relation to it. And equally and finally is that collaboration piece, to work together across agencies and with the private sector to actually identify the evolving threats. What's the best practice for harnessing, managing, preventing these threats from actually getting into the networks and the systems, and being the most affordable that it can be to be able to deliver that across your wider network and your whole piece. You can't now just concentrate on you as an individual or you as an organisation. You have to concentrate on all the networks that are around you as well.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. My questions are for both of you, and I'm going to start, if I can, about public sector cyber attacks. And obviously, I think as a public, we're now more aware of them, and particularly recently, for example, in June this year, Synovis, the pathology service for the NHS, was the victim of a ransomware attack, which resulted in medical appointments being cancelled, hospitals having to employ runners to run backwards and forwards to the labs. And of course, we're really aware, particularly of the Electoral Commission's recent woes with regards to its cyber security. Can you just briefly explain to us why were those and similar public sector cyber attacks successful? And could they have been prevented, or are they inevitable to some degree? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can't speak to the specific details of each because I'm not aware of the actual details in relation to each of those. The criminals are very good at using and targeting things that are in the open in the media. They will exploit whatever they can that's there. So, I think it's 5-6 years since we had the WannaCry attack, which targeted the NHS, which was an exploit, which at the time was 6 weeks. A patch before it was released 6 weeks before. So it's those organisations in ensuring that they've got their patching, their backupping of their systems. But equally, go back to what Madeline says, that's valuable data for them to use, maybe not only for the ransomware, but equally then to be used for other offending and to sell on for other offending for targeting as going forward. During the COVID pandemic, data along those lines when they focused on looking at breathing devices, masks, medical equipment, etc., etc. So understanding who were the people that needed them at that particular time. So I can't take those two specific cases that you've put there and link them together. But in general, it's that ability to target a specific area for their needs, and then use it not only in the present but then also in the future as well. I don't actually think, in conscience terms, criminals consider the impact of their offending and worry about then people having to run between labs and that sort of thing as well. And I think that's possibly a cultural thing that fraud and cybercrime are both not seen as impactful offences. nobody actually is physically assaulted, or most of the impacts are psychological and or second or third level physical impacts. So culturally, I don't think we see cybersecurity as a cybercrime or fraud as a physical threat, and prioritise it along the other aspects that you would sexual offences, serious assaults, etc., etc.
Thank you. I mean, I highlighted those two cases just to highlight, but the broader point about public sector organisations, which are often have thousands of employees.
Exactly.
You know,
I'd just add a couple of things to Gary's very good points. One is that to a certain extent, we accept that because of this ecosystem of insecure software and hardware that we're working with, these kind of breaches or incidents, however hard we may try, are to some extent not inevitable, but it is likely. And this is why, as Gary said, organizations now really focusing on resilience and on how, when the unfortunately inevitable does happen, how then will we operate? How will we continue with business? And that's a whole of business question. But I think that there's also, worth doing the kind of work that we do, which is look into these attacks in organizations. And for example, the NHS, not the more recent Synovus one, but the WannaCry attack, there was a lot of blame on NHS IT staff that, well, they should have done this, or how on earth could they still be running Windows XP, by this date. But the reality of these large public organizations, that very expensive equipment that they had purchased that could only run on Windows XP. So there was to suggest that they would replace those MRI scanners or to update their Windows software, it's not possible. It's not feasible. And the reality was that after that attack, Microsoft did offer the support package to the NHS. Now, they could have done that before that attack. They kind of bringing in at this point, I think it's $7 billion per quarter in profit. I think they could support some of these public sector organizations a little better. And if the NHS in England can't afford the support packages for outdated equipment and software, then what on earth is happening in the rest of the world? So I think there's a real question of accountability there and responsibility that goes back to those organizations that, they have a monopoly and they're providing these operating systems that don't last. So, yeah, those... there's a lot of reasons why those attacks happen in public sector organizations that go beyond the kind of narrative of staff incompetence or, a lack of budgets.
I would just add, for a long time there was an imbalance between physical and online security. Physical securities for organizations, they would have CCTV, they would have, getting in here, with the passes and the searches and et cetera, et cetera. It's now we're seeing that the online security is starting to catch up with the physical security. But equally, it's looking on boards-wise, do they understand that resilience that's required in the cyberspace is as important as that resilience is required in their physical infrastructure as well. And sometimes the cyber aspect of it is not ignored would be the wrong word, but it is not prioritised because of a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, and a lack of realisation of what the impact is on an organisation if one of these offences take place.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you sort of hinted at my next question, and that is these various attacks that take place, what is the learning that comes out of them, and does that learning then build resilience in the future? Don't know. And that's with regards to both public and private companies or organisations.
Well, there has been some group learning within the local government community, that's for sure. And we participated in a round table at St. George's House a few years ago where some of these incidents were shared and the lessons learned from them were shared. And I could kind of summarise some of the learning from those, which was that, resilience as a priority. It's most likely to happen, and then how will we deliver these critical services? That budget isn't always the answer. Of course, more money makes it easier, but it's not always the answer. And the kind of example that Gary pointed to, with, again, in hospitals where they want people to, log into an iPad to access patient data, but that's completely impractical in the midst of saving someone's life to ask a locum to go and get a password. So these kind of understanding of the work that happens in the public sector and local government particular. I think also there's a particular problem in organizations like this, which is that it's not possible to pay competitive salaries for IT staff and cybersecurity staff. And that's not in any way to denigrate the people who do work in those roles here, because I think that they work, I'm full of admiration for them. They work under incredibly difficult conditions with a deep sense of responsibility for what their work means to the community. But very often, the way IT people and cybersecurity people, develop professionally is by moving to different organizations, encountering different systems, different problems, and learning along those ways. And that doesn't tend to happen in a lot of cases. People will stay in public sector organizations because they value other things like the work-life balance rather than the salary. And so I think it's important to think about how are we developing those people who are staying here, have that great institutional knowledge, but aren't getting that kind of professional development that they might get if they were working externally. So I think investing in those people is really important. And then I think also the point that Gary made about these kind of principle-based approaches that are beginning to emerge in talking to senior business leaders about how can you understand more about the cybersecurity of your organization, not the technical details. No one wants to learn that, but how can you have that level of oversight of your organization in terms of cybersecurity? That whole body of work is beginning to develop now. And there's some very good work coming out of the UK, certainly a cyber governance code of practice that I think will be out shortly. But Australia also has a very good one. And these are just ways for senior leaders to think about their organization. As I said, not to get down to the technical kind of nitty-gritty, but as an organizational leader, how can I be satisfied that we're taking the steps that we ought to?
Thank you.
I think taking the learning is incredibly important, and I do think it's happening going from. There are debriefs that go on in relation to large investigations and large cyber cases that are involved to identify the roots in the first instance, and there are now devices that are around like Police Cyber Alarm, which will look at and scan the ports of its members to show which ports are more accessible, which ports are open, and that's only become and been developed through previous attacks and things like that. You've got the cyber resilience centres that are in each region. London has one, I believe it's funded by MOPAC, partially funded by MOPAC, which create an affordable way of providing advice, guiding, penetration testing for businesses and organisations that come through. Equally, and I know I'm using a lot of acronyms here, and there are some that I can't actually remember what it stands for. I've written down MHLCG, which I think is local communities and government, but I can't remember the MH piece. But they've developed recently a cyber assessment framework to provide clear cybersecurity standards for local government, and I believe that's been launched this year, February 2024, and it's developed to help organisations take a systemic approach to assessing the extent to which they are managing their own cybersecurity risk. So local government departments are required to adapt the CAF in a way that is appropriate to public sector organisations within their scope. And I think the supporting documentation, guidance and templates is being developed and adapted at all times. And that's been developed from the learning that has come out of some of those attacks that are coming forward. I personally don't know the criteria for that assessment framework, and I don't know whether it's been adopted across local authorities, but I would hope that that there was some thought that it had.
Thank you. It's Ministry of Housing. Ministry of Housing, the MH stands for. Thank you. I have just a couple of other questions, if I can. I was quite interested to hear that in Scotland, the Chief Police Officer responsible for this has recently said that in particular with regards to ransomware attacks, they're being thwarted because companies are not reporting them. I presume there's reputational risk, but there was also the suggestion that private companies in particular have insurance, and as soon as the insurers get involved, cooperation with the police can stop. And I'm just wondering how big an issue that is and what can we be done about it, because we've just talked about the learning that comes out of people sharing their issues, and presumably that could stymie efforts to learn from that learning.
Yes, that's actually something that we found in higher education, that we did a survey of, I think it was about 160 higher education institutions in the UK, their CISOs, and that was one of the key factors that they highlighted as an impediment to them sharing information, was insurance, and the fact that as soon as an incident happens that they were prohibited from speaking about it with their colleagues. So where they would normally call their network at other HEIs, they could not do that. And that is a real problem that needs to be sorted out with senior management and with insurance providers, because it does get in the way. Looking at those kind of networks of how people share information is very interesting and very worthwhile. And I think when we were doing the work with LGAs a couple of years ago, we found that in similar to the higher education sector, that there's a real willingness amongst individuals to share information, but there are very good, clear reasons why they don't do that. And I think it would be something worth looking at in this sector as well, because probably some of the same reasons apply as that one, but there may be some unique to this ecosystem that are preventing people from sharing. I mean, we found that we wondered why more local governments didn't band together to purchase their cybersecurity provision and work more closely, and there were some kind of interesting reasons why that didn't happen. And I think information sharing would be a similar case.
I wondered, Chair, whether we could ask for those reasons to be sent to us after the meeting, because if we're looking at recommendations, that might be something we want to pick up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Gary, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, firstly, I've got to say that I agree with what Madeline said. However, reporting of any crime is not mandatory.
Yeah.
And so, whilst I accept, the premise that has been put forward, we can't compel people to report when they are victims of crime. I would arguably hope as many people would report as possible, because the key way for us to be able to combat the threat is first to understand it. And unless you've got a clear picture, and go back to what I said at the beginning, 1 million instances of Computer Misuse Act offences and 40,000 reports. Now we can do our analysis on those 40,000 reports to start looking at what the threat picture is and what's the best way of dealing with it and addressing it. But arguably, the wider data set that we've got, the better that we've got on our analysis, the better we can identify what the attack vectors are and then look at the areas that need to be strengthened. So yes, I'd encourage everybody to report cyber crimes. It's interesting when you say, 48% of businesses have a policy not to pay ransomware. And obviously, we can't compel people, like in a traditional blackmail or a bribery case, we can't, blackmail case, we can't compel people not to pay the ransom. We can only provide them advice and guidance in relation and a recommendation that they shouldn't pay the ransom. There are some things that have recently come in relation to paying ransom to those under sanctions in relation to the war that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. If they do pay that, they're liable for other criminal offences. But arguably, it's that reputational risk as well. It's the board being able to balance whether they want the publicity around it, whether actually the benefit of reporting is greater or worse than actually the impact recovery. You'll find that most large organisations now will have disaster recovery plans, and they will have incident management plans. Not all of them will initially indicate that reporting to police being the first aspect. And I was just looking at some of the figures. Only 34%. So in the last 12 months, only 34% of businesses identifying breaches reported the breach to anyone outside of their organisation. Within that 34%, most reported to banks, building societies, or credit card companies. That was 32% of that 34%. 10% reported to the police and 10% reported to website administrators. So there are other areas that they can report to. Arguably, I would hope that everybody would report to police because it gives us a better opportunity to look at it, but I can't compel people to do that.
Thank you. My final question in this section then is, we talked about the reputational damage to business and their recovery costs and losses, but presumably if there is a data breach, for example, people's personal details are obtained, then that person is susceptible to cyber attack themselves. So is there a duty either on private businesses or public organisations, if they have been and they are aware that information has been taken, to notify their customers, their service users of this so they can protect? And if there isn't, should there be?
There is a requirement if there has been a data breach and a data loss of personal information to report it to the Information Commissioner's Office, and I think it's within 48 hours. But that doesn't, and then have a plan in place to demonstrate to the Information Commissioner's Office what security was in place beforehand. And that all comes under the GDPR regulations and the Data Protection Act regulations as to what the liabilities are for that company if they don't do that. So there is a structure in place for them to report there.
But are they obliged to report it to the people whose data has been stolen?
Well, I don't think they necessarily are. They're obliged to report it to the ICO. I don't think that they, I'm not sure of that, to be honest. If they're required under the GDPR to report to the victim themselves, or if they have to just simply do that publicly, like you would announce another kind of public business issue. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
And it depends on what you mean by reporting it. So if a large organisation tells their customers that we have been the victim of a cyber offence, data has been lost, we don't know if it's yours, or do you mean do they have to specifically contact each individual person, which could run into the tens, thousands, et cetera, et cetera. I can't answer the second one. I know that the first one generally takes place.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Follows on quite nicely because I want to talk a bit about the human impact and the kind of people who are reliant on the services that get impacted by cyber attacks. So my background before I was elected was in the NHS and the public sector, and I'm also a counsellor in Hackney, so understand the details of the cyber attack that's happened and the stories that come from individuals, things like misinformation from the council, letters harassing people that they owe money, which they didn't owe, and really, really impacting an individual's kind of mental health. Things like repair systems being really difficult, so repairs being outstanding for 6-12 months. So I was really surprised when you said they are seen as not impactful crimes, because if you asked anyone in Hackney their experience, it would be, I think they'd be very alarmed to hear that the cyber attack wasn't considered impactful on their lives. So I think that was really interesting. So I just didn't know if there was any kind of analysis or collation of that part of a cyber attack experience, like that, the people who are reliant on the services.
Could I just say, I didn't say I say
No, it's not your opinion.
They're not,
I know it's,
they're not perceived. I do think they are very, very impactful. From having worked in this area, I think it's one of the difficulties that we have in measuring what actually the impact is. With other crime types, as I say, if it's a murder, you know that somebody's died, unfortunately. If it's grievous bodily harm, there are levels of impact that you're able to measure. I don't think there's actually any framework of measurement of the impact of, apart from a monetary element, that I've given you, to quantify what that impact is at the moment.
Well, this is part of the problem, isn't it? Because when the attack happens, it's generally about getting valuable data or getting access to systems. And this is why, as Gary says, there's this sort of perception that this is, I don't know, a business issue, or it's I mean, people don't really say this anymore, that it's a victimless crime, but that type of narrative around these things. But the impact of those attacks, where someone on the other side of the world simply looking for payment details or something like that, the impact is so incredibly profound, particularly in local governments. And I would say this was something that we've heard in some actually very moving kind of presentations by IT staff that worked in councils like Hackney, of the enormous responsibility they felt, because they know it's the most vulnerable people in that community who are really, really suffering. And there's a terrible sense of responsibility on those IT staff. Have they done something wrong? Have they missed something? Is it their fault that these people are now, encountering these extraordinary difficulties? And I think that's something worth, because we've seen in some of these, I think it was Copeland, that following that, it took years to really restore the systems in Copeland, that people ended up leaving their jobs in that council because it was so stressful. So the impact of the people who work closely with that community, and of course the community itself, is very, very significant. I don't know how you quantify that except by telling those stories, really, and making that understood.
Thank you, Chair.
Just add on, I'm going through various pages from various strategic assessment documents. And I do see that I have a graph that, the question has been posed in the Crime Survey of England and Wales in relation to what the emotional impact of being a victim of Computer Misuse Act offences were. And 53% of people have come back and said they were not emotionally affected at all, whereas only 5% were very much emotionally affected. So we're starting to get the data together to actually start looking at what the impact is and how it impacts people. I don't think we've got a overarching answer to that question yet.
Yeah, because I think that's my sense, and I think that reflects it, that there's like the general frustration and general difficulties, but then for a minority of people it is incredibly difficult and damaging. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. I really have been finding this fascinating, and I'm so pleased that we're talking about this, because I think you're right. Not enough people know the impact that this is happening. The human element that you've just talked about, I think, is so important. My question does come from the previous question on the learning, on what the public sector organisation can do about human error, legacy systems, and shortage of cyber skills, which I think you've all already touched on. So I'm going to just ask a question on the role of the government. You did mention this earlier about Microsoft and why that wasn't brought in earlier, and it had to have a massive issue that happened in the NHS for Microsoft then to come forward and offer that scheme. But it wasn't just the NHS, it was the Electoral Commission, it was the Hackney Council. There are so many public organisations that are dependent of that support. What role does the government have in making sure that these public services have that support?
Well, I think the government is the only mechanism that can drive that, or that can change that, because as I think I said in the opening comments, we've believed in, particularly in the West now for 50 years, that there was some market. There would be some market drivers for cybersecurity, and it just simply hasn't emerged. There's sort of two symbiotic markets, or there's the market that quickly rushes software and hardware and services out and gets them in play, full of insecurities, because no one really is buying these things based on security. And then there's the other side of the cybersecurity sector that comes along and mops up after them. And those two halves of the sector kind of rely on one another, not changing in a way, but it doesn't work for us because we're constantly buying these raincoats full of holes. So the only thing that we've seen now, just thankfully, in the last, maybe I would say as little as 5 years, we've seen governments taking a more proactive stance of accepting their mandate. If you read back on national cybersecurity strategies, you know, a couple back, it was all about the public-private partnership and how we would work together, you know, I mean, the private sector is not incentivized in the way that we have hoped that they would be. And by accepting that, and then governments taking the steps necessary, either by standards, by voluntary codes of practice, or by regulation, that is the only way that will change. And even, you know, I remember when the GDPR came in and a lot of people were saying, oh, business will hate this and there'll be so much pushback against it. We spoke to a lot of CEOs and board members at the time who said, well, thank you. All we've ever asked for is to have it quantified. What will it cost if we have a breach? Now we know we can invest appropriately. But prior to that, it was very amorphous. It was just, you know, we need more money for cybersecurity. So I think by governments really accepting that's not going to happen through the market, and working out what kind of initiatives and incentives can be introduced by government is really the only way that will change.
Thank you. Gary, you also mentioned about the lack of awareness that even the criminals themselves have of the impact that they are doing to others through this crime. Do you think that, again, from the government's perspective, there could be a role for public awareness from the government, you know, even a campaign to highlight those emotional stories and the impact that that those crimes have? Is there a role that they could play here?
It's a difficult question for me as a serving police officer, obviously, being independent, but all I can say is the government do. They have given us the National Fraud Strategy. They've given us the National Cyber Security Strategy. They've provided funding in relation to us to be able to set up the cyber resilience networks, to provide the police cyber alarm, to set up the cyber protect networks throughout the regions and through local policing, to specifically look at businesses and supporting businesses and organisations in preventing this type of crime going on. So there is a role for them to play, and I know I work very closely with the Home Office policy lead for both fraud and cybercrime in order to be able to deliver that out where it's required, and also that, you know, as I say, they've recognised the importance of this area of business with the refunding of the new Action Fraud and National Fraud Intelligence Bureau service to, you know, promote the reporting and recording of these crime types. The government has delivered a consistent, you know, fraud campaign. Stop, think, fraud. With the second iteration, I think is due to go live towards the end of this year of targeting, and that's really been really important because, you know, having that consistency of messaging, it's been a very crowded landscape with everybody with the best intentions wanting to raise awareness and promote behaviour change, but individually using slightly different messaging, you know, which has created greater confusion than it has to actually its original objective of raising the messaging. So to have that one significant campaign that everyone within the industry and certainly within, you know, the policing environment can focus on and support, actually reduces that confusion and allows us to help and empower victims.
And specifically on cyber skills, apparently 50% of UK businesses have a security skills gap. I mean, the government has said that they are investing more in trying to increase the diversity of and number of people who are skilled in this particular sector. There's also a role for the Mayor of London, who has an enormous budget for adult education. Is there something that we could be improving there as well?
I think the public sector is not immune to the global skills challenge that there is in terms of cybersecurity. And, you know, it often has to compete with the private sector to retain talent. I think Madeleine spoke about it earlier. And yes, there is that upskilling of as many individuals that we can to make cybersecurity, you know, knowledge and awareness business as usual, as it were, or commonplace. But that recruitment and retention is quite difficult at the moment, with that competing against private sector and the packages that private sector can pay in comparison to the public sector.
Thank you, Chair. So fascinating stuff off the back of the engagement with Assemblyman McCartney and Assemblyman Bakari. It's raised a couple of questions for me. So I remember a while back I was watching this YouTube video of a bunch of senators interrogating Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, and the level of questioning, I don't want to be disparaging of my American colleagues, but I found they weren't very well briefed. And I think sorry? And Democrats. It's got to be fair to everyone. And the level of questioning, you know, clearly I felt that they weren't very well briefed on just the fundamentals of Facebook, how security worked, how customer data was used, how they raised revenue. And so when it comes to policymakers, how do you feel the level of education is, or understanding of the severity and the lack of vulnerabilities around this space are, just from policymakers? I don't mean the public, but just educating those within government of whichever political stripe.
I mean, it's something that can always be better, of course. I have to say the colleagues that I work with in DCMS or NCSC, of course, or DCIT now, you know, they are pretty well informed, actually, and I think they do have, you know, a strong team of people behind them. One of the things we have found, though, that is a bit of a vulnerability in the UK is that the public sector, you know, this kind of approach to generalists, and that people move around so quickly from completely different portfolios. And there are very few people in HMG below the policymaker level that was supporting them who have been working in cybersecurity for long. There are a handful of them, and I think that's something really that I would recommend is considering career pathways for people who really do need to build up that specialist knowledge, and that they don't then move after 18 months to agriculture or justice, but they stay and develop a career within that portfolio, because it does impact on the level of advice that they get and the level of briefings, as you pointed out. I mean, that one was quite shocking, but it's difficult when you have people moving so quickly.
It's getting better, would be my understanding. You know, senior management, I know you call them policymakers, but senior management and those responsible for governance, because of some of the events that have occurred, you know, are now becoming more aware. You know, looking at it, 75% in the surveys that we're doing at the moment, 75% of businesses say that cybersecurity is a very high priority for their senior management, and that they are starting to put governance in place. You know, I talked about disaster recovery plans, incident management plans, network monitoring. You know, the governance is only as good as the audit and compliance in relation to that governance as well. So some could be reassured by the fact the policy's in place and they understand what the policy is, but how many then are actually making sure that that policy is being followed through. So I think it's the level of understanding is getting better for those policymakers. I know certainly, we've had a lot of visits from people in the political arena over the last year or so, trying to get an understanding more of what we're doing in terms of fraud and cybersecurity and the reasons why we're doing it. And we've actually put together, there are 3 strategies out at the moment. There's the fraud strategy, there's the cyber strategy, and there's the economic crime plan 2.0. And they all overlap because they all leak into each other, as it were, and the City of London have brought the 3 of them together into one overarching strategy, and we've shared that and go through that. So more can be done, as Madeline says. It can always get better in that understanding of the fraud and cyber world. Certainly in policing terms, traditionally it's not been an area that has been the most focused. When I joined the police force, murder, the robbery squad, etc., things like that was where I wanted to go into. But more and more people now are recognising that the fraud and cyber arena at the higher levels of management need that knowledge and understanding.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm also grateful for choosing the wording that you did, because if you had said things can only get better, one of my colleagues had burst into song over there. So, my final question on this bit is, Madeline, you've mentioned that the market has not kept up over the last 50 years. But from what my understanding of what you said is, the market exists. There are sellers and there are buyers for these products and systems. But the problem, the way I see it in local government, looking at what you've said, is procurement. If local government does not know what it's asking for, it's unlikely that it's going to get it. That doesn't absolve these big companies of any culpability in not providing regular updates. But if they don't know what they're asking for, they're not going to get it. So do you think that is, in large part of the problem? I don't want to put words in your mouth. It's just trying to decipher what you said.
Yeah, procurement of these systems is incredibly complex. And when you have organizations that are publicly accountable, there are very stringent processes, rightly so, for doing that. And that often brings in people who perhaps don't have that level of technical understanding, that necessary. And it's not, we have, on the board of a cybersecurity provider. So I've seen these kind of procurement processes from that side as well. And it can be frustrating that they don't understand what they're looking for and what they're buying. But I think even when they do, the reality is that we operate in a world of monopolies, of Microsoft's, Google's, Amazon's, and those organizations are not investing in security to the extent that we would like them to, and that we have continually expected would happen. Because originally, going back years, looking at how software was developed for an organization, you would have a team of software developers inside the GLA, wouldn't you? And they'd be working on your payroll system or your comms system. But we quickly realized that we could outsource that and buy it off the shelf, and that's what we have done. And homogenization of systems like that is the absolute, that is the underlying principle of cybercrime, because once we all using the same homogeneous systems, we need to only find that vulnerability once, and we can exploit it over and over again. So it is possible to write secure software and produce secure hardware, of course, but it's expensive, and we don't have, we don't see the investment in that. It's too expensive.
Thanks, Evelyn. Just to expand quickly on that, I think from those 2 points. So, is there any way or recommendation which would help local authorities, regional authorities with procurement process? 1, and 2, is there any way or recommendation you could see that would force those larger companies to properly invest in those security updates, patching?
To the second one first, I think that when you were sort of saying, like, what's the next 10 years hold? I think will hold that. I think because it will take. I mean, I've advised, done training for cyber diplomats in ASEAN. All 10 countries together told me that if they requested a meeting with, Facebook or Microsoft, that they would struggle to get it. 10 countries together. So those organizations are so powerful now that it would take a concerted, coordinated effort in order to, for example, request that across the UK, we're all paying enterprise licenses for Microsoft. We'd like to have Copilot available to our staff, and not at £27 million a year. So that's the only way that will happen, and I see that happening with the UK's, secure by design, software code of practice, these kind of beginning steps to hold those organizations to account. And sorry, I forgot the first question.
Just on that, helping local, regional authorities and public bodies, I guess, in general, with that procurement process and knowing what it is they need. How can we get there?
Yeah, I think by cooperation. And as I mentioned earlier, there are reasons why there's not more cooperation in that space, and be happy to send those in of what we found through that study. But it really, by increasing the market share, working together, sharing those lessons learned, and having a kind of ecosystem of your own that works for you in terms of procurement of those services.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. I'm going to go more into the reasons that the cybersecurity strategies needed. Now, there is arguments to say there are barriers, technical barriers as well as cultural barriers that I think you've already alluded to. And a report from King's College actually had some really interesting insights of when they did a study of 600 adults that found that women were less likely to protect themselves because current safety advice is not inclusive of their needs, which I thought was a really fascinating report. So maybe if you could just explain why this is a real issue for us.
Well, I mean, a lot of that work on cybersecurity, and this is why you mentioned earlier about this, building in diversity in the cyber workforce. It's partly because different people have different skills and ideas to contribute, but it's also so critical that you have people involved in developing these initiatives that have that lived experience of how different people approach these things. I mean, one of the things that I see in London is this, this misunderstanding amongst the public about phone theft, that this kind of epidemic of phone theft here, people seeing that as a property crime and not understanding. I would love to see the tube plastered with posters saying, it's not the phone, you can replace your phone, it's the emptying of your bank account, within minutes of them taking that phone. But I don't think people understand that. So sort of speaking to people about the cyber crime that they encounter, every day, how it impacts them, will change behavior. People understand that all they need to do is put their phone on a lanyard, and not have it just in their hand, but also have their phone protected so that if it does, if it is out of their hands unlocked, that they're not susceptible then to that cyber crime. It's really about understanding the victim.
But I mean, I'm just thinking about the discussion we were having about human error. Why is it that in this particular report it was saying that women were less likely to have an understanding of the language, and why do you think that's happening? Is there I think that's a fascinating result from that report.
What was their lack of understanding?
The report actually is from the King's College London Department of Informatics, and it said that there was a stark gender gap in access and participation, and one of the problems was that accessing online safety opportunities, just making sure that women and girls are included in those discussions. Is that a real issue, that the fact that they're not part of those discussions?
I've not read the report personally, so I can't answer it in relation to that. I do know that some of the things that we've looked at in some of the types of offending from the analysis that we've done, social media hacking seems to be targeting women more. So we've now got domestic abuse training for our officers and those that are involved within our area, and certainly for violence against women and girls as to what's acceptable and not acceptable. The revenge porn that goes in those sort of things, so that we've brought all of them into to identify, address, and make sure that we safeguard the victims in the first cases in relation to that. So yes, that diversity piece is being included. Possibly needs to still go wider and catch up, but it's certainly been addressed in relation to that in the first instance.
I was also wondering whether there is any evidence from your experiences of whether age is an issue as well. And you mentioned fraud earlier. I'm sure that there's probably an age aspect to that as well.
It's interesting you should ask that. I've just been looking through it, and our strategic assessment has come out. So it depends on the methodology that's employed. So things like courier fraud are targeting people over the age of 70. Investment fraud is generally people more 50. Traditionally, we used to think romance fraud was, from the data, was women between the ages of 40 and 60. We're now finding actually it's more likely to be a man between the age of 25 and 35. Sextortion, things along those lines, are young men between the ages of 19 and 30. And we're seeing a lot more of that targeting of age group with online shopping and things along those lines. So yes, we are looking at getting into the segmentation piece, particularly to be able to provide the right guidance to the right people in the right medium, and that is something that's on our radar that we're working forward. And we generally use behavioural insight in terms of how we should be delivering our messaging and what messaging we should be delivering, depending on the segmentation group that we've identified.
And you mentioned, Gary, earlier about security training. Do you think that there needs to be a change in the way we use language to make it more inclusive? Particularly for those particular, groups, security staff, but also those security staff who are giving us the advice, on how to protect ourselves. Because we've had security training, but I think it's more about the physical security that we get as members of the Assembly from our security staff. Does there need to be a shift in the way security staff is trained as well?
Simple answer, yes. I do. All of these things, as I say, is where we're playing catch up within the cybersecurity arena. They are going on, and they are starting now to take effect, and you're starting to see the results of them. But yes, we need to continue with that approach now and continue prioritising this in order to make it effective and look at the various different ways that we're looking at it. Equally, I think data scientists and data ethics needs to be looked at in the way that organisations collect and manage the data that they have at the moment. Should they be collecting the things? It's addressed at police with facial recognition and things along those lines. And part of the new system that we're delivering will have a team just looking at the data ethics situation for us to make sure that we are collecting the right data and we're not collecting data that impacts on one particular characteristic or another. To make sure that actually that's the best way of improving the delivery of our service going forward, and that people can trust our service going forward.
And just finally, on the need for the change in terms of making language inclusive, but I'm quite interested in how we could be starting earlier. So we're talking about it from the context of the workspace and public sector, but shouldn't we be starting from a much earlier stage, from primary school level, where we are teaching children at that stage to start thinking about security? Because kids are using, laptops and phones at a lot earlier age, and they will be home. They'll be, perhaps picking up parents and sharing the laptops as well. And these things happen. Human error happens. So we need to make sure it's going across the board.
I think we actually are. I think the technology piece post the millennium, I'm going to call myself the older age group, like myself, where have it's happened in our lifestyle, and we're having to play catch up in relation to how we use it, how we talk about it, how we understand it. You know, my children's age group, again, are in a similar position, but they are more engaged in it, and it probably wasn't in their curriculum during their age group. My children are 30, so you know how old I am now. But I'm looking at my grandchildren now, and my grandchildren, I'm already seeing it coming into schools, and that security element online is getting better and better and better. Equally, things like the Online Harms Act, which was passed to make sure that online is a protected space for our younger people, and there is responsibilities on the individuals that provide that online space, or the metaverse, for want of a better, are protecting those individuals. I think that's, you know, because they're born with this technology in place, whereas I wasn't. I think that's naturally started to build in, and they probably know more about it than I do.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good opportunity, I think, to thank schools and staff, because I say with my children, when I try to have conversations, the responses I always get is, yeah, I know. And I think that's the work that schools do from a really early age now, above and beyond what a lot of teachers would have expected to do, I think, a few years ago. Assembly Member George Hugh.
Thank you, Chair. I feel like we've skirted some around what I'm about to ask, so please don't feel the need to repeat yourselves. But the second bit we definitely haven't covered. So, how should public sector organisations assess the strengths and effectiveness of their cybersecurity strategies? And can you provide examples of good organisational cybersecurity practice? Now, I appreciate we've covered some areas of where there have been significant harm, i.e. Copeland, Hackney, and other organisations. So it would be really good to know where in the UK we could look to for best practice.
Well, in terms of assessment, I mean, I think the cyber assessment framework that Gary mentioned already is where I would, recommend beginning. And there's a lot of guidance on how to use that and how to implement it. And then I do think these frameworks that are coming out of the UK, and I mentioned the one from Australia, which I think is just excellent. Cybersecurity governance principles, I think it's called. I can send it to you if you wish. Just allowing organizations and organizational leaders to really think, as I said, not at a technical level, because not the strength of organizational leaders, but as a business, as an organization, how are we situated? How are we situated to defend ourselves from what's out there? And most critically, what will happen the day it occurs? Who will do what? Who's responsible for what? Who's connected to whom? What's the decision tree? That kind of work is work that every organization can do, and I think it's that I would recommend, is looking at those frameworks that are coming out and looking at how they could be implemented within the GLA, because those things will make a big difference.
Thank you. And in terms of, sorry, Gary, just while I've got you, in terms of which local authorities you'd look at, regional authorities, who do you think? I appreciate we've registered the first bit on effectiveness, but on the second bit of who should we look to as this body to say, actually, they've got it right?
I don't know if I could single out I don't know if I could single one out. I mean, I would say that there's a kind of understanding that in Scotland, they have a very good kind of coherent ecosystem working together up there, and it might be worth looking at, not just in local government, but also in their higher education sector, both. When we looked at both of those, and we found that for some reason, Scotland seemed to be working very well. So I don't know whether I'd say they have nailed it, but something they're doing is working. And I think it goes back to the question that you raised earlier about information sharing. Somehow they have got that information sharing working effectively and or more effectively than it is in other places.
Four things as at an organisational level. So I'll give you four things at an organisational level and then four things at an individual level. So organisationally, I think it's really important that organisations strengthen their cyber governance and risk management and have appropriate frameworks and policies and audit and compliance in relation to those policies. I also think it's really important that organisations proactively plan for cyber incidents. So they've got the documentation in place, see that it's actually fit for purpose. They undertake regular training exercises as a board, as staff, and cascading down, and also have continuous evaluation that's going on throughout the time. I think they need to use regulatory mandates as a catalyst for continuous improvement for their cybersecurity practices. So if it's a regulatory requirement, it's not something you should do, it's something you have to do. And if they've got that as a mandate, then they can put that into the prioritization of it. And I actually think that all of the organizations should be looking at innovative technologies that will help them stay ahead of the curve rather than playing in this catch-up. So organizationally, that's where I would see the priorities for any cybersecurity team in any local authority should be looking in those four areas. As individuals, I'd say that we all should be looking at multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, good cyber hygiene. You know, how many of you have sent a reply all email and actually half of the group aren't actually in your organization anymore? So making sure that the right people have the right access to the various different areas of your network and take that as an individual responsibility rather than hoping for it is going to be picked up in the general audit and compliance of things that go through. So those are the sort of things that I would be saying to people that they should be looking at.
Thank you. I know on Oversight we're normally a power-through committee, but I'm very aware we've got two external guests that are facing a barrage of questions, so I'd quite like to give them a short break. So I'm going to end the meeting here, and if we could all be back by 11:30, that would be great. Thank you. are back, everybody. Moving on to questions around national cybersecurity and the landscape of that, and I'll pass over to Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. Hi, Gary. Hi, Madeline. Yeah, so obviously we're getting into quite a lot of the detail, but the questions I want to ask are about the national cybersecurity context, because obviously that's quite important in the overall sort of collaboration and partnership area, and also how much advice they can give to public sector organisations and support. So, and you touched on it, I think, Madeline, when you were answering something else. So would you say all the existing national cyber strategies and expert national bodies providing an effective framework to keep UK public sector organisations safe, or is there more they could be doing?
Well, maybe that comes back to the statement that Keith just made to me when on a sidebar, but it comes down to money. I mean, I would say the NCSC is regarded internationally as an exemplar, particularly for that way that they came out of, behind the curtain of in GCHQ and developed this public-facing body for advice. And I think people would regard that as a real success and a highly effective organization. But yeah, the feedback that we sometimes get is that they're overwhelmed, and that when approached for support, they're not always in a position to provide it. And it's this combination of private sector cybersecurity provision that organizations rely on and the NCSC. The reason why we look at organizations and humans is because of this connection to national security. My interest is in international global politics of cybersecurity and emerging technologies, but at the end of the day, what that means is what happens inside an organization with human beings. So there's a very direct connection between national security and the kind of things that we've been talking about in the first part of this meeting. In my mind, they're intrinsically connected. And supporting the public sector to mitigate against those risks, I think it happens quite well in the UK, but there's always scope for more. It comes down to resources.
Gary, would you like to add anything to what Madeline's just been saying? Do you feel that the national bodies are giving that support?
Well, we work very closely with the National Cyber Security Centre, and a lot of the advancements that have come about has been as a result by having an overarching government body that leads on the problem in relation to it. We work with them across the consistency messaging. We've worked with them in relation to developing intelligence in order to be able to take enforcement activity in relation to some of the largest offenders. Equally, the National Crime Agency work again very closely with the TICAC approach and the laydown of the different sorts of levels of work that's being undertaken. If you were to ask me, could policing do more? Yes, I believe policing could do more. I believe that all organisations could do more. But I think the model that we have at the moment is one that definitely helps towards the improvements that have been happening over the recent past.
Okay, thanks. Just looking to the future then, the Government Cyber Security Strategy 2022-2030, which to me sounds like quite a long time span in this field, but leaving that to one side, that states that the government's critical functions will be significantly hardened to cyber attack by 2025, so that's just in a few months' time, with all government organisations across the whole of the public sector being resilient to known vulnerabilities and attack methods no later than 2030, but that's 5 years' time. And I just wondered, is the UK on track to achieve this objective, and what is the biggest challenge to doing so? And of course, it is only talking about current known vulnerabilities, doesn't, can't predict the future. So,
well, I guess that would really come down to things like, patching protocols and these kind of processes that we're already aware of that organizations should be doing. So there's a list, I think, of 8 known actions that if organizations took, they would reduce their susceptibility to cybercrime or cyber insecurity by a quite significant number. And I guess, it makes sense to look at ensuring that those things are in place across government. And I would expect that there's a program of work to carry out, to ensure that. And that will be helpful, of course. It's the unknown, vulnerabilities that will be, I guess, the ongoing problem. And really, cybercrime is such a lucrative and relatively safe crime. There's a likelihood of being apprehended or charged comparative to the money that can be made is sort of, it's a revolution in crime, really. So and really the people who work in that field are unbelievably creative, it's talented and innovative. And so we're obviously worried that people aren't doing now what they could be doing. Organizations are not taking these kind of known steps, but that's unlikely, I guess, in the long term to protect us from what will come, because there's just so much innovation in cybercrime that they'll be onto something new before we've even got through this round of mitigations, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that was my feeling, and also having a strategy that runs over such a lengthy period doesn't really seem to address what you've called creativity, because I mean, they are very talented people who are putting it to the worst possible uses, and people who do then end up in a very difficult set of circumstances, losing, what seems small to that. It seems small to the villains, but £30,000 for most people could be their life savings.
Of course.
And they've got no money left at that point.
Of course. And that's why there's a bigger systemic view, I feel, that's necessary, because this just constantly mending the hole in the raincoat is that we've been doing that for a long time now, decades, and it hasn't really got us anywhere. So there's there's more systemic thinking that's necessary, and one of those things we've talked about a couple of times is this approach to resilience, that an organization can continue to carry out its critical functions without its systems. And for how long, and does everyone know how to do that? That's becoming more and more important. Ironically, as we become more interconnected and more automated, that's becoming more and more important.
Yeah, regular staff training, perhaps to deal with that as a sort of worst case eventuality.
Yes.
And is that something we've considered at the GLA?
Have you considered it at the GLA?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's the regular training of your staff. I can say, we are on track, in terms of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. I can also say that it's constantly under review and amendment for refreshing if it needs to be refreshed. Part of the track is as I say, the cyber assessment framework for local authorities, which will encompass a large part of the things that you are talking about. Yeah. It's a bit like the Cyber Essentials program that used to be run for businesses, to make sure that your industry has a checklist of things, as it were, to ensure that your cybersecurity is as good as it can possibly be. Continuous professional development in this area, as the word says, needs to be continuous. Yes, there are emerging trends. I can see now, for example, in the policing environment, we're investing more on training people about cryptocurrency and how to recover cryptocurrency, identify that people are in possession of cryptocurrency wallets and things along those lines, as much as we're looking at legislation has now improved so that we, under the Proceeds of Crime Act initially, before cryptocurrency wasn't included when that came out. Now it is included so that we can address that, and more of our staff are becoming comfortable in that sort of area of being able to provide advice and guidance. We have more people within policing that treat this as business as usual, as rather than it being a specialism, as because actually the vast volume of offences now are cyber-enabled offences and predominantly fraud that comes out of that. So
yeah, I think we were questioning the mayor, and somebody asked a question about with the police commissioner and the balance of offences was something like 80% of all offences are now cybercrime. I mean, that seems incredibly high, but I can see that you're both nodding, so maybe it's incredibly true.
I think statistically 80% of fraud offences are cyber-enabled. Okay. I wouldn't say that 80% of all offences are cyber-enabled.
That sounds more likely, yeah.
So I'm looking at the data in that respect. There are a lot of offences in terms of child exploitation and things like that which are online as well. And I know that there are investigations of traditional offences in the online space. I know that there's sexual offences that have been alleged and are now, whereas it hasn't been a physical interaction between two people, but within the metaverse, as it were, and those allegations and looking at that. So, as I say, the progress through the various pillars, I think there's 3 pillars of the cyber strategy, and part of that is increasing the policing response and the judicial outcomes from criminal investigations of cybercrime. But equally, the second pillar of it is the resilience piece in terms of empowering people and raising awareness of people. I was mentioning to the chair outside in the break, it's only 3 years ago that actually people having a strong password was too difficult to do or too time consuming to do, and the common password at the time was a very, very well known one, which I won't repeat just in case.
I thought it was password 1234.
That was it.
Or something ridiculously
but
predictable.
Now we're seeing lots more people actually adopting having a more secure password and protecting themselves. So I think, from my opinion, I think we're on track to hit what the cyber strategy was. But constantly, if there's new emerging things, AI has become, and large language models and machine learning, and has something that's come forward since the cyber strategy. But there are processes in place to start to address that as well.
And also the development of facial recognition software, but also then the deep fakes. So then I'm thinking, well, everyone's talking about thumbprints and facial recognition being a great thing, but if someone can impersonate my face, then they can break into all my systems if I use facial recognition as my part of my security. So I probably won't be doing that but I'm sure that wasn't something when the strategy started in 2022. It was something that we were talking about a lot.
It does go back to that cultural triangle that I talked about: functionality, accessibility and security. There's an overt focus on functionality and accessibility, and sometimes security is lagging on behind.
Well, I think that's an issue, that whether or not people are learning things at a very young age at school, people just... in London, people get cross if a tube train doesn't turn up within 2 minutes and they're standing on the platform. So if it takes them 5 seconds longer to use any kind of software, they start to get cross, and they won't do something every time. It's like having to say no to cookies every time you go onto a website, even if you use the website hundreds of times before, and it's extremely annoying. And then people just go, oh, yes. And then the website will never ask you again because it's got the permission to put the cookies there. And people are very, very not willing to see these as important issues. Cookies, not as just an example. But.
Could I just make a comment on that? Because I think you're exactly right. But this is one of the things that we've done increasingly over the last maybe 10 years is put this responsibility, this burden, this emphasis on individuals. Yeah. And yes, it's true. Someone may impersonate your face or your biometrics in a physical way. So they may do that, with a camera or a photograph. But then the responsibility has to lie really with the organization that's receiving that data and does not have. So why maybe there needs to be someone standing there watching that people are not doing that people are presenting their face and walking through the gates, because you see these things work incredibly well in some places. People walk through public transport, or they walk in and out of shops, and they are using their biometrics, and it works incredibly well. But those organizations that are using that need also to take some responsibility for that security, and we can't keep putting it back on individuals, on school children, on people at work to do that. There is plenty of money floating around in these sectors, isn't there? And we need some of it to be diverted to allowing us to make the most of these innovations, but mitigate against the risks.
But the big tech companies have all fought against that, haven't they? Apart from when they want to say, oh, well, we offer this particular communication system and it's encrypted, and of course we can't unencrypt it for you to look at the private conversations that people are having, because, that completely destroys our Apple or Microsoft or whoever's business model. And, there's been quite a row to make them say, no, actually we can look at all the WhatsApp messages between people, or we can look at all the... I have no idea whether you can look at all the Telegram or the Signal messages, actually. But, that has been an issue. But the rest of the time, they do seem fairly happy to leave the gate pretty widely open and make things very, very simple to use, but not necessarily secure, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's
so
very
can
lucrative.
governments negotiate on that? Because they don't seem to have been very successful so far.
The online, I don't know if you're aware of the Online Harms Act. Is certainly addressing some of that. The Corporate Transparency Act, with facilitating fraud, is also addressing some of that aspect as well. But equally, there are other things, that need to be looked at. Some take online shopping. Some of the things that are being advertised. My age, it was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. And we were all advised about what activities we had to take before signing on the dotted line and taking it away. Is it that the individual responsibility or the organisational responsibility? So there's still that argument, but I do think it's becoming more in a legislative and regulatory framework in some of the areas, which probably will expand as time goes by.
And then give a better operating system, if I can use that word, for all the public sector organisations, including ones like the GLA, to be able to operate in a more secure system? Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think we're in a period of transition from governments not recognising that they have a mandate in this domain to realising that they do. And if we look at something like the GDPR, which far from perfect, but it is, I would say, a step in the right direction. We haven't actually seen all that many significant fines for GDPR breaches. But perhaps I hope that this is a few years really of transition where we don't, because in other parts of the world there have been some very, very big fines for organizations that have breached those type of regulations. So I think that we need to now have just a little bit more bite behind these regulations and see that they're implemented in a way that does actually offer an incentive for change behaviour.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you, and I hope I'm not in danger of being one of those politicians referred to by Alex earlier about not understanding. But both of you have, talked about the advent of AI, and how that, I think Gary, you said that has come on since the development of some of the framework of the framework, and obviously AI has a self-learning element to it, and public authorities are being told, perhaps quite rightly, that this is the future for them as well, particularly around freeing up resources and customer service. Can I just ask you, in terms of security, what extra challenges does that contribute to, and what can organisations such as GLA or other public organisations, do they need to put anything extra in place than they are doing already?
I mean, one of the problems with this current discussion about AI is that AI is a very big field, and it's also a field that we already live within. So we already use AI and operate with AI in many ways. And the thinking around this is the future of these large language training models. Some of the mitigations that the GLA would want to be thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, the provenance of the data. So where the data is going and who has access to that data, what data is being used in the training models, because you've seen some of these examples where, and it kind of goes back to Member Bakari's point about who's having input into these things. If you train on biased or weak data, you generate a biased or weak model, where our data is going and who's got access to it, who's using it, in what jurisdiction does it sit. But then also these environmental issues about the cost of training AI models in terms of, energy, air conditioning, and resources. So those kind of, seemingly sort of ancillary questions about how much resource it takes to do that, and is that a good use of resources for the GLA? But predominantly, I guess in the near term, it would be the protecting the data, knowing where it's going, and knowing what data is being used.
Thank you. My final question then is about something you touched on earlier when you asked for examples of good practice. You mentioned Scotland seems to do that information sharing very well. But is there any other ways in which individual organisations can work better with national authorities or organisations like the NCSC or policing and crime authorities to actually make sure that we do counter cybersecurity in a better way? Is there anything you'd like to see, in other words?
I think there's two things here. One is we can't compel them to do it. We can offer the services out there, and we can develop the services out there. Two is it's the affordable nature of cybersecurity. At the moment, it can be incredibly expensive for smaller businesses and micro businesses and SMEs to deliver the same level of security as larger organisations can invest upon. We will continue to develop, whilst this is such a significant threat, we will continue to develop and continue to offer different opportunities. But again, a bit like we can't mandate people to report fraud, we can't mandate people to take those steps either.
Okay. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
If I'm completely honest, I think those services are already and will continue to be completely overwhelmed. Even if you think about a regulator, it's not possible for us to have a regulator large enough to really oversee data protection or data breaches. I mean, so we've sort of taken this step to now accepting that governments do have a role, and that they have a mandate, and they have a level of responsibility that these kind of what may seem very individual or organizational cybersecurity risks do, they do cascade upward to a national security concern. But how to do that, we have not really worked out. So the idea of the police, conventional police or police force being able to deal with this massive, increase in online crime, and just thinking, well, we need more people, we need to to me, it's not really feasible. And what we've seen actually is, while all this innovation has been going on in technology, and in systems and processes. What we haven't seen is a real innovation in governance and policy making. That's still, we do that very much the same way that we did 200, 300 years ago. It's very accountable, very transparent, very procedural for all those good reasons. But it's very difficult to actually take those systems and processes that we're comfortable with and that we work with, what our police force is, what our national security culture is, what our policymakers and how we govern. It's very difficult to superimpose that over top of this ecosystem. And you see this constant, kind of criticism that policymakers are behind the ball, or legislature is behind the trend. We know there are good reasons why that's so slow and deliberate, but we're going to have to innovate somehow in how we do that work, because that you could encourage organizations to engage more with national cybersecurity resources, but those resources they're finite, and they're probably overwhelmed already.
Thank you. I think one of the things I've taken away as well is that everyone has a responsibility in this field, whether it's national, regional, organisational or individual. We all have a part to play in making sure that we're cyber aware and safe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And we are moving on to the last few questions now around cybersecurity and the GLA. I'll ignore the chair. I'll pass over to Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I've got a couple of questions that about what might be most relevant for the GLA and organisations like the GLA, although I think actually you've covered a lot of this at various different angles, so absolutely no need to say what you already had said, but an opportunity to say anything I think haven't been covered. So what do you think the most significant threats are for organisations like the GLA or our functional bodies like TfL, i.e. big public sector organisations based in London? And are there specific risks? We've talked a lot about public sector, I think, but are there specific risks to organisations based in London?
I've certainly spoken about the generic threats. I've got no specific assessment in relation to the GLA or the vulnerabilities in relation to the GLA. One of the first thing I would recommend is understand what the threat is to the GLA, and I think we've tried to advocate what the generic threat is out there in terms of cybersecurity. It's now to go away and think about how that specifically relates, because a lot of the things that we've spoken about will be relevant to the GLA, but actually until you look yourselves and have that assessment yourselves as to what the vulnerabilities are, I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah, no, certainly weren't asking you to advise specifically on the GLA, but like organisations like us, big public sector based in London, but I know we have talked about that, but so if there's nothing more then that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
It is having that review your, what is your cybersecurity? Do you, a lot in the olden days, it was all devolved out to the IT office, or do you have a separate, CISO, Cyber Information Security Officer? Yeah. Do you have a separate cybersecurity place like you would have a physical security department, and then do an audit through the governance in relation to that before then looking at the various mitigation things that you've put in place, both for your network, your people, and your technology. Would be my advice in relation to look first.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I'd just add one thing on that, and sort of from a more geopolitical perspective, perhaps an added risk for London is just the profile of this as one of the world's great cities, and I'm sure you think about this every day. But in terms of if it were not, say, just a crime, a financially motivated crime, but it were perhaps an act in an effort to have some political impact, yes, that London would presumably be a target in that regard.
Yes, and being as a government organisation as well, do you feel that that is something that certain organisations or people who conduct these crimes would find of interest.
Yes, you'd have that added appeal as a target, if I can say that. If we move away from just financially motivated crime, which is obviously the huge bulk of cybersecurity threats and cybercrime, but looking to something more politically motivated, yes.
Yeah. But are there any different ways to react to being aware that is obviously a consideration, or is it simply the same sort of measures that you take as if it was purely financially motivated?
In my view, yes, it doesn't really matter all that much where it comes from or what the purpose is, from the perspective of the people that you serve. So at the end of the day, it's about how do we get the services back up and running, and how long will that take? And kind of comes down to the same thing. The rest is politics, as Rory and Alistair say.
I'd just add, obviously, the financial motivation is generally for organised crime and individual actors. Obviously, you as an organisation would possibly be looking at state actors targeting you as well for whatever purposes as required. So I'd be looking at that sort of level of your security as well.
But they'd use the same tools, I'm assuming, and I am one of those politicians who doesn't fully understand this. So, but they'd use the same tools. So in terms of somebody who's trying to find out who'd done it, that would be an indication. But in terms of our security or organisations like our security, then it's the same sort of measures, regardless of who might be and for what reason.
With the advent as a service, so ransomware as a service at the moment, an organised crime group don't need to have a wealth of cybersecurity information. They can go and buy the service in relation to being able to deliver it. State actors tend to be a little bit more sophisticated and more hidden.
A bit more in-house, maybe.
And lots of them have more resources as well to throw at it.
Thank you. I think that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Well, being the tail end Charlie, I think most of the answers have been given to this question, so please don't feel obliged to repeat yourself. But if there's anything more you can add, I'd be grateful to know what it is. Basically, how can an organisation like the GLA ensure that its processes are as robust as possible via its governance, training, processes, etc.?
Yes, I mean, we have discussed that a bit today, and I'd say I'd go back again to those kind of frameworks, organizational governance frameworks that are coming out, but really by meetings like today, where you're clearly engaging with the issue, thinking about your organization in this way, thinking about what's working, perhaps what needs to change, what could be improved or what could be reinforced. And I think that's in many ways that's a incredibly positive step that you're having this conversation, and I know there are more to follow, but thinking through what does this mean for us as an organization is a very powerful step.
Yeah, I'd agree. The governance we've talked about, the training is absolutely critical to staff. With the drive for effectiveness and efficiency within local authorities and public services as a whole. Making sure that our staff are given the correct training to be able to recognise, a compromised email, or, one of the things that we're seeing now is not just everybody knows clicking on links is a bad thing, and we've got secure email gateways that are in place. One of the current trends at the moment is the QR code coming through as opposed to the link. Now that's been coming through, so that continuous training. Then starts getting it into people's minds and gets them to focus on it.
Sorry, I've got one question for you both, actually, because I'm a heavy user of my own devices. Does all this really mean the end of bring your own or supply your own? Does it mean that in future organisations are going to have to insist you use their devices rather than, as at the moment, I I have the GLA account, I have a business account, I have my borough account, all on the same phone. I can work with everything. Does that mean the end of bring your own?
I don't think it's the end of bring your own. As somebody asked me earlier, when you've got a wider network, it creates a wider vulnerability. However, if you're applying the same cybersecurity to your own device that's linked into a network, then that's a good thing. I do think it's easier if you've got an organisational device with all the organisational security factors that are put in place. But I've still got my device as well.
I have mine as well, but in all honesty, yes, it is a threat, and a safer way. And the reason why people who work at very secure organizations don't have BYO is exactly that. That when you have an account, I have my personal Gmail, my TikTok accounts or whatever, and my work accounts on the same device. Yeah, it is a risk, in all honesty. But this is sort of gets to these kind of societal questions again. This is how we work now. The reality is we don't go into the office every day. I don't know if you do or not, but we have to work remotely. We have to work on the road. We travel for work. And we have a lot of our personal lives also online, and we don't want to carry two devices. And that's just the reality. So, perhaps we could say, well, let's have a technological solution to that. That can't be, that can't be a million miles away. Everyone wants the same device, but we need some parts segmented. That there is a impermeable barrier on our device between our work accounts and our personal accounts. I don't know. I mean, I would ask for that from the technical community, because this is the way we work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it could be the end of bring your own at the GLA, because we spoke recently about how people turn up and not be given anything. So we'll probably still have bring your own for a while longer. Yeah. Well, thank you both, Gareth and Madeline. That was absolutely fantastic, and that really sets us up for our investigation. We will not look like the senators questioning Mark Zuckerberg after all that information you've given us today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and answer those questions this morning. So thank you to, I guess we are going to take just a couple of seconds to close off some business, and then, so if I could ask you to just wait a moment longer. Moving on to item 9, the Secretariat Quarterly Monitoring Report, May to July 2024. Can I ask the committee note that report? Noted, thank you. Can I ask that the committee note its work programme for 24-25? Can I inform the committee that the next committee meeting of the Oversight Committee will be on Wednesday the 23rd of October at 2 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall? Perfect. And I have not received any urgent business, and so I can declare this meeting done.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is